The night had fallen over the city with an unsettling stillness, as if the empty, dark streets were waiting for something to happen. Clara Bennett was sitting in her living room, going over notes for a story she was about to publish. There was a nagging feeling in her chest, something she couldn't explain but had been growing over the past few days. Her mind kept returning to the same point, the most recent crime, the most brutal one yet, and the frustrating failures in the investigation to find the culprit. She had covered countless tragedies in her career as an investigative journalist, but something about this particular case haunted her in a different way. It felt personal, as if the pain and despair of the victims had seeped into her own skin, suffocating her thoughts. The sudden sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, breaking the oppressive silence of the night. Clara hesitated for a moment before getting up. It was late for any visitors. When she opened the door, there was no one there, but on the ground lay a small package, poorly wrapped, with her name hastily scrawled across the front. The wrapping was worn, as though it had passed through many hands before reaching her. Her eyes scanned the empty street, but there was no sign of movement. Just the long, silent shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. The eerie sensation of being watched crept up her spine. She brought the package inside, locking the door with all 3 locks. She sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside was a flash drive and, bizarrely, an old, crumpled photo of her former colleague, Matt Collins. The sight of the picture momentarily knocked the wind out of her. Matt had died 5 years ago under mysterious circumstances during an investigation they had been working on together. She thought she had buried those painful memories, but seeing that photo brought everything rushing back in a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. Unable to stop thinking about the reason behind the package, Clara plugged the flash drive into her computer, hoping for some clue about the sender. Instead, what appeared on the screen was a grainy video, filmed in a dark room. In the center of the frame, a woman was tied to a chair, sobbing desperately. Her mouth was gagged, but her eyes pleaded for help. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The timestamp in the corner indicated that the video had been recorded less than 24 hours ago. The audio was distorted, but in the background, Clara could make out a deep, almost inaudible voice whispering something. She tried to increase the volume, but the recording wouldn't allow her to make out the words clearly. Just one final phrase before the screen went black. She knew too much. The image disappeared, leaving Clara in complete shock, her heart pounding erratically. Her hands were clammy, her thoughts racing too fast to organize them. Who was this woman? Why had they sent the video to her? And, most disturbing of all, why was Matt's photo included? She took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She grabbed her phone and dialed her contact in the local police, Detective Sam Edwards. As she waited for him to answer, her mind scrambled for some logic to explain what was happening. Sam's raspy voice finally came through the line. Clara quickly explained about the package, deliberately leaving out the part about Matt's photo for now. Sam promised to send a team over immediately to analyze the contents. While waiting for the police to arrive, Clara couldn't shake the growing feeling that she was more deeply involved in this case than she had first imagined. Matt's presence in that package reopened old wounds but also left her with an unsettling sense that the past she had tried so hard to bury might be directly tied to the horror she now faced. Time seemed to crawl as Clara stared at the black screen of her computer. The silence in the room was suffocating. When the doorbell rang again, this time more urgently, she almost jumped out of her chair. She opened the door to find Sam standing with 2 forensic technicians. They quickly gathered the flash drive and photographed the package, but Clara noticed something strange in Sam's expression. He seemed tense, more so than usual, as if he knew something he wasn't ready to share. Before she could ask, Sam took a step closer, looking deeply into her eyes. "Clara, are you sure you don't know who sent this?" The question caught her off guard. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. She shook her head, trying to maintain her composure, but the truth was that none of it made sense. As Sam left her house, promising to stay in touch as soon as they had more information, Clara felt the weight of the silence once again filling the room. She knew that the package was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would lead her into the dark corners of her past, places she never wanted to revisit. Alone again, she found herself staring at the crumpled photo of Matt. His gaze seemed deeper now, as if hiding secrets she could never fully understand. Clara realized there was no turning back from this mystery. Clara's footsteps echoed through the quiet house as her mind couldn't stop racing after what had just happened. The image of Matt in that old photograph was like a dagger twisting in her memory. There was something more to that picture, something that seemed to be hiding just below the surface, but she couldn't quite grasp it. Her hands trembled, and the sense that she was losing control grew stronger by the second. Matt Collins had been more than just a colleague. They had worked together for years, tackling some of the most dangerous and dark cases Clara had ever covered. But that wasn't the only thing that connected them. When Matt died, Clara was right there, working on an investigation that was never finished, leaving her with an unbearable void. His death had always been considered an accident, but deep down, Clara had always suspected that there was more to that tragedy. Every night, the details would come back to haunt her, like pieces of a puzzle she could never quite put together. The doorbell rang again, much softer this time, pulling her from her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found another envelope on the ground. No return address, just her name scribbled in the same rushed handwriting as the package earlier. She picked it up and, with a growing sense of dread, tore it open. Inside was a simple note, with just one short sentence written in the same ink: "You know more than you think." The words echoed in her mind like an accusation. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew she was getting pulled into something dangerous, but couldn't step back. There was something about these messages, about the video, that was pulling her into an unknown abyss. She knew she had to keep going, even if it meant facing parts of her past she was terrified to confront. Her phone rang suddenly. Clara looked at the screen and saw it was Sam. He had promised to call if he had any updates, but the tone in his voice when he picked up the call immediately told her he had more questions than answers. "Clara, I need you to come down to the station immediately. We need to talk about the video." His tone was firm, but Clara could sense there was more behind his words. She agreed to meet him, hung up the phone, and quickly grabbed her keys, heading for the station. As she drove through the dark, empty streets, her mind wandered back to the moment when she and Matt were working together on that fatal investigation. It was a big case, something that could have changed both of their careers. They were digging into powerful figures in the city, politicians, businessmen, and influential members of the community. There were signs of corruption on a scale they had never seen before, and they were just one step away from exposing everything. And then Matt died. Clara had blocked out many details of that day, almost as a natural defense against the unbearable pain. She remembered being on the phone with Matt just before the accident. He sounded agitated, more than usual, and said he needed to find something important. Less than an hour later, she got the news that he was dead. A car accident, the police had said at the time, but Clara never fully believed that. There was so much more to that case, and she knew that whatever was happening now was somehow connected to it. When she arrived at the station, Sam was waiting for her outside. He led her to a private room where two investigators were analyzing the video she had received. As Clara entered, the silence in the room became palpable. One of the investigators glanced at her with concern, while Sam approached her, holding a folder of documents. He handed it to Clara, who quickly opened it. Inside were photos from the crime scenes tied to the serial killer she had been investigating. In each one, a pattern emerged. The victims bore eerie physical similarities. They all, in some way, resembled Clara. She looked up at Sam, her expression demanding an explanation. Sam hesitated, as if he didn't know where to begin. "We've been going over the videos and the evidence you received, and then we noticed a pattern," he finally said. "All of the victims share an unusual connection with you. Not just physically, but there's something more, something we can't ignore." Clara sat in silence, processing his words. Could it be that the killer was trying to send her a direct message? And if that were true, why? "You think he's targeting me?" Clara finally asked, her voice low but steady. Sam nodded, clearly uneasy with the idea. "We're not sure yet, but it seems like he's taunting you, pulling you into these crimes. And this can't be a coincidence." Fear grew inside Clara, but with it came something else, determination. She knew that, somehow, she had to figure out what was really going on. And more importantly, what Matt had to do with all of this. As she flipped through the photos again, a disturbing thought crossed her mind. What if everything she believed about Matt's death was wrong? What if he wasn't just a victim, but a key player in something much bigger? There were too many unanswered questions, and Clara knew that the only way to find the answers was to dive deeper, even if that meant confronting truths she didn't want to face. Sam continued talking about the investigation, but Clara barely heard him. Her mind was increasingly fixated on one question: what had Matt been investigating before he died, and why was it all coming back now? Clara felt a rush of adrenaline. There was no turning back. The past she had tried so hard to bury was resurfacing with a force she never could have anticipated, and the shadows of that past were closing in on her from all sides. She knew she was standing on the edge of something terrible. The cold night air wrapped around Clara as she left the station, her mind still spinning from the revelations Sam had shared. The idea that the killer was selecting victims based on some mysterious connection to her was terrifying, but also impossible to ignore. She felt like she was being pulled into a carefully laid trap, but couldn't resist following each clue. Back in her car, Clara allowed herself a few minutes of absolute silence, staring at the steering wheel as if waiting for the answer to all her questions to appear, simple and clear. But, as always, only more doubts surfaced. She knew she needed more information. The victims' photos kept flashing in her mind, each of them with details that seemed to resonate disturbingly with parts of her own life. Determined to understand what was happening, Clara decided to follow her own investigative lead, one that ran parallel to the police's efforts. She knew Sam was trying to protect her, but she also knew he didn't have access to certain information that she could uncover herself. The killer was communicating directly with her, and if she wanted to solve this, she would have to get into her own mind, connecting the dots of the past. Her first stop would be the home of Rachel Adams, one of the latest victims Clara had been investigating for her column before the murders started taking such a personal turn. Rachel was a young attorney, known for fighting against powerful local businessmen. The last time Clara had spoken to her, Rachel had been deeply involved in a corruption case involving major public figures in the city. Now, her death seemed to be at the center of it all. Clara needed to understand why she was targeted. When she arrived at the address, the house was still marked off with police tape, but the scene was deserted. Clearly, the crime scene had already been cleared and investigated, but Clara had a habit of finding details others might have overlooked. She looked around, trying to imagine how Rachel lived, what she was doing before she was attacked. The silence around the house seemed to press down on Clara, as if the place held secrets waiting to be uncovered. With a stealthy movement, Clara slipped under the tape and entered the house. Inside, the air felt still. The smell of a place shut for days hit her, making her breathe deeply to resist the urge to leave. Each step she took through the rooms drew her deeper into what she now recognized as a solitary investigation, something only she could solve. In Rachel's office, Clara began sifting through files and papers left behind. The discomfort of invading the personal space of a dead victim was unsettling, but necessary. There was something here, she could feel it. After a while, she found a notebook, hidden beneath piles of legal documents, with handwritten notes by Rachel. Clara read carefully, recognizing some of the connections Rachel was making between different names and local businesses. Then, a name jumped out at her. Matt. He had been mentioned in one of the cases Rachel was investigating. Clara almost dropped the notebook. What did Matt have to do with all of this? Had he been involved at a deeper level than she had ever realized? Her thoughts began to swirl. What if Matt's death wasn't an accident? What if, somehow, he was far more entangled in these webs of corruption than she had ever known? Clara's head spun. Could Matt have discovered something too dangerous to ignore? Could that be why he died? Clara had always felt like there was more to his death, but now it seemed that she was finally seeing the pieces come together. More questions flooded her mind. If Matt had been investigating the same people as Rachel, did he know how deep the corruption went? And had Rachel found out something that made her the next target? Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to keep the dizziness at bay. But there was something else. Rachel's notes mentioned secret meetings, and one of the locations listed was just a few blocks away. It was a small bar Clara knew well, a discreet spot where the city's influential figures often gathered out of the public eye. Clara decided she needed to investigate that place later, but for now, she carefully tucked the notebook away. There was something important here, and she knew she couldn't leave it in the hands of the police. Back in her car, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched again, as if someone or something was tracking her every move. The weight of paranoia was sinking deeper, and she knew that the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back. She had to keep moving forward. As she drove back home, a new message appeared on her phone. It was from an unknown number, and the text contained just one word: careful. Clara stared at the screen, her heart racing. The killer was watching her, and he knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. The threat wasn't just real, it was imminent. The sense that something terrible was about to happen made her grip the steering wheel tightly as her eyes scanned the streets for any sign of movement. She knew she was being followed. And now, the next step wasn't just about discovering what Matt and Rachel knew, but also preparing for what was coming next. The drive back home was filled with a suffocating sense of isolation. The silence seemed alive, hanging in the air like an invisible shadow, and Clara's mind was on constant alert, bracing herself for the next blow. Ever since that last cryptic message, *careful*, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every distant sound, the rattling of the windows with the wind, or the rustling of trees outside, made her turn suddenly, as if she expected to find someone lurking in the shadows. The weight of paranoia was slowly crushing her, and the connection between the deaths, Matt, and now Rachel, seemed more intricate with each new piece, woven with a precision that left her unnerved. Sitting at the table, Clara spread out the papers she had taken from Rachel's house. Between the notes and legal documents, something was emerging, a network of connections tracing a thin line between the victims. But it wasn't just that. Matt's name kept coming up again, like a ghost haunting her, forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about his death. Clara had always suspected that Matt's death was tied to something much bigger, something she had never fully understood. Now, that suspicion seemed to be confirmed. She had to find out what really happened, but each new piece of information only seemed to deepen the mystery. With every clue she found, Clara felt like she was being drawn into the same dark game Matt had played, following his steps and inevitably heading toward the same fatal end. She grabbed her phone and started dialing Sam's number. He was one of the few people she still trusted, but their last meeting had left her uneasy. The idea that someone inside the police force could be involved was constantly on her mind, and Clara wondered if even Sam was being completely honest with her. As the phone rang, the sound cut through the silence of the house, but Sam didn't pick up. Clara hung up, feeling a wave of frustration mixed with a growing sense of dread. Something wasn't right. She opened Rachel's notebook again, skimming over the notes that mentioned the discreet bar where secret meetings supposedly took place. She decided she couldn't wait. There was something at that place, and she needed to find out what it was. Besides, Clara felt that every minute wasted left her more vulnerable, more exposed to the killer who always seemed one step ahead. Without hesitating, she grabbed her keys and left the house, keeping her eyes sharp for anything unusual. Every movement in the shadows of the empty streets made her heart race, but Clara kept her head high, determined. The bar was a place where politicians and businessmen often gathered, away from the prying eyes of the media. Clara had been there before for previous investigations, but now everything felt different. The feeling that the walls of the place held dangerous secrets was undeniable. When she arrived, Clara entered quietly and settled in a dark corner, observing the scene. The place was almost empty, except for a few regular patrons and a bartender who seemed to have been there for decades, serving drinks without asking questions. Clara ordered a drink, more to blend in than out of need, and began watching. She knew something was about to happen, and she needed to be alert. Her mind wandered through the clues she had gathered so far. The pattern, the victims, the hidden details in notes that no one else seemed to notice. Then, something caught her attention. A man walked into the bar, dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in such a casual setting. He looked around, as if searching for someone, and when his eyes met Clara's, he hesitated for a moment. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong, but she kept her composure, pretending not to care. The man approached the bar, ordered a drink, and sat a few feet away from her, keeping her in his peripheral view. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that he was there because of her. She pulled out her phone, pretending to send a message, but was actually taking pictures of the man discreetly. Something about his posture, the way he scanned the room, felt off. Clara knew she was in dangerous territory now. The connection to Rachel, to Matt, and to the other victims was becoming clearer, but also more dangerous. If that man was part of this web, she would need to be extremely careful. Moments later, a notification buzzed on Clara's phone. She glanced at it quickly and froze when she read the message. "I know where you are." And so does he. Terror surged through her, and Clara stood up immediately, her heart pounding. The man at the bar stood up too, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. Without thinking twice, Clara rushed out the back door, feeling the cold night air wrap around her. The mental chase had finally turned physical. Running through the dark streets and trying to keep control over the panic rising inside her, Clara realized that the game was reaching a dangerous point. Every move she made, every step she took, was pulling her deeper into a web that had been spun long before she got involved, and now it was too late to back out. When she reached her car, breathless, Clara looked back, but the man who had been following her had already vanished into the shadows. Her phone buzzed again with a new message, this time shorter and more direct. Matt knew. "And now you know." The connection between the past and present was becoming more evident, more terrifying. Clara knew there was no escape now. The killer was leading her, piece by piece, toward the final confrontation. But before facing what was coming, she needed to understand what really happened to Matt. Clara leaned back in the driver's seat, her heart still racing, and closed her eyes for a moment. There was no room for doubt or hesitation anymore. Clara sat parked on a deserted street, still trying to catch her breath. The latest messages echoed in her mind like a disturbing refrain. Matt knew. And now you know. There was something Matt had discovered before he died, something she needed to understand. The connections between the crimes, Matt, and now herself were undeniable, but the pieces of this puzzle were still scattered in her mind, fragmented and unclear. But the truth seemed closer than ever, as if each step was bringing her straight to a revelation that would change everything. After a few minutes of trying to calm herself, Clara realized she couldn't wait any longer. She had to revisit the memories she had spent years trying to bury. The only way to understand what was happening was to confront the past. Her shaky hands gripped the steering wheel as she made the decision to head to Matt's old apartment, the place where he had lived before he died. Back then, Clara hadn't had the courage to return to the site, but now she had no choice. If something was hidden there, she needed to find it. The building where Matt had lived was small and unassuming, just the way he had always preferred. Clara climbed the stairs with hesitant steps, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. When she reached the door to Matt's old apartment, Clara hesitated for a moment. She still had a copy of the key, one she had never returned, and now it felt like a sign that, somehow, she had always known she would return to this place. Inside the apartment, the air felt stagnant, as if time had frozen since the last time Matt had stepped foot in there. Clara moved slowly, her hands grazing over dust-covered surfaces, trying to absorb every detail. She knew that something important was hidden here, something Matt hadn't had the chance to reveal before he died. But where? Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a clue, something that might have been easily overlooked by others, but that Matt would have left for her to find. After searching the apartment for what felt like hours, Clara collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion and frustration growing inside her. There was something she was missing, something obvious. Then, her gaze landed on an old wooden box, half hidden behind a stack of books. Clara stood up quickly, grabbed the box, and placed it on the coffee table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the lid. Inside was an old notebook, filled with Matt's personal notes, hurriedly scribbled across the pages. It was as if he had been trying to document something urgently, before his time ran out. Clara began flipping through the pages, her heart racing as she read. The notes began with details about the investigation they had been working on together, but slowly, Matt's focus shifted to something more personal. He seemed to be growing more obsessed with a conspiracy he believed ran deeper than the corruption they were investigating. He mentioned meetings he had with unnamed people who were connected to a much bigger secret. Then, near the end of one of the pages, Clara saw her own name. The words jumped off the page at her. Clara is involved, even if she doesn't know it. I need to protect her. They're using her. Her mind froze. What did that mean? How could she be involved in something without knowing? The confusion overwhelmed her. The questions kept multiplying, but the main one was, who were they? And why would they be using her? Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her out of her shock. Once again, it was a message from an unknown number. Now you understand. But you still don't know everything. Panic surged through her. Someone knew she was there, knew what she was discovering. It was impossible this was just a coincidence. Clara stood up quickly, the notebook still clutched in her hands. She needed to get out of there before it was too late. But as she walked toward the door, another realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Matt knew his death was coming. He knew there was something that could get him killed, and yet he kept investigating. Why? Was he protecting someone? Or was there something he simply couldn't walk away from? Clara knew the answer lay in the notebook. The mystery wasn't just about who was behind the murders, it was also about why Matt felt the need to protect her. She knew it was crucial to find out before the killer caught up to her. The apartment now felt like a labyrinth of dark memories, and Clara felt like Matt's ghost was following her with every step. He had known something she still hadn't fully understood, and the killer was playing with that knowledge, leading her toward a truth that could destroy her. Clara needed to act fast. She shoved the notebook into her bag, determined to uncover the full truth. She was ready to face whatever it was, even if it meant confronting her own demons. With one last look around the apartment, Clara quickly left, the sound of the door closing echoing through the empty hallways. She knew the next step would take her even deeper into the darkness. Clara could hardly think as she drove through the dark streets of the city. Matt's notebook, now safely tucked in her bag, seemed to burn in her hands, as though it contained secrets capable of unraveling everything she knew. His words still echoed in her mind: Clara is involved, even if she doesn't know it. I need to protect her. They're using her. More and more, the line between the past and the present blurred. If Matt knew something was going to happen to him, who were they? And how was she involved? The night was unusually silent, and the isolation around Clara grew heavier with each passing minute. She didn't trust anyone. Sam, though still her closest contact in the police, seemed distant, as if he, too, were hiding something. Now, more than ever, she needed to dig into her own past, something she had avoided for years. Maybe the truth had been there all along, buried in the shadows of her memories, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Clara couldn't go home. She felt the killer getting closer with every step, watching her movements with terrifying precision. So, she drove to the office of the newspaper where she worked. The building was almost deserted at that hour, except for a security guard who greeted her with a disinterested nod as she entered. In the familiar and quiet environment, Clara felt a strange sense of safety, even if it was only temporary. She knew she needed more information, more connections between what Matt had discovered and what she was now uncovering. She sat at her desk, spreading out the papers and notebook in front of her. Clara's eyes fixed on Matt's hurried notes, as if he had been interrupted before he could fully document his discoveries. Clara flipped through the pages, looking for any clue that might explain who they were. Buried in the notes, a reference to the name of a local businessman caught her attention: Richard Townsend, a name Clara knew well. He was one of the city's major players, always involved in large projects and political funding. He was influential enough to bury dangerous secrets, but how had Matt gotten to him? And why was he relevant now? Clara started searching the newspaper's digital archives, combing through old reports on Richard Townsend and anything that could connect him to what was happening. Then, Clara found something. An old article, archived for years, written by her and Matt about a huge scandal involving public contract corruption, in which Townsend was named but never formally charged. There had been speculation, but nothing solid at the time. Matt believed the investigation could unravel if they dug deeper, but before they could, he was killed. Clara had never given it much thought before. She always assumed the accident had been just that, an accident. But now, everything was changing. The more Clara reread the old article, the more she realized that the people mentioned in the report were connected to the recent victims in some way. These weren't household names, but Clara knew they were influential in local business and politics. This explained why Rachel had been investigating the same group. But it also meant that, in some way, Matt had gotten too close to the truth. And now, Clara was too. Her mind turned to the last few months before Matt's death. He had grown distant, more withdrawn, something she had attributed to stress at the time. But what if it was more? Clara began to feel that, in trying to protect her, Matt had ended up hiding important details of the investigation. And somehow, this involved her more than she had ever realized. She knew she needed to dig deeper into Richard Townsend, and, more importantly, confront him. If he was part of this web of corruption and possibly responsible for Matt's death, she couldn't stay on the sidelines any longer. It was then that a notification appeared on the corner of her computer screen. A private message, from an unknown account, appeared in Clara's inbox. The subject was short: "Want to know the truth?" She hesitated for a moment before opening the message. The content was disturbingly simple: an address, scheduled for the next day, and a final phrase, "Come alone. You're closer than you think." Clara stared at the screen, feeling her heart speed up. The killer was still one step ahead, as always, but now he seemed willing to reveal the truth or manipulate her even further. Who was behind this message? Was it a trap, or her chance to finally get the answers she had been searching for? She knew she was walking into danger, but she also knew she couldn't turn away now. She closed the laptop, fully aware that her every move was being monitored. The psychological game was reaching its climax, and Clara needed to be prepared for anything. She picked up Matt's notebook once more, flipping through the pages one last time before securing it in her bag. His words still echoed in her mind: "They're using her." But using her for what? With every new clue, Clara felt like the truth was closer than she could have ever imagined. Back in the car, the night now seemed different. Every street, every alley felt darker, as though something was about to be revealed. The address she had been given led her to a remote location, far from the busy city center. Clara knew she couldn't trust anyone, but she also knew she had to see this through. There was something waiting for her there, something Matt had discovered, and that was pulling her deeper into this nightmare. As she drove, the car's headlights illuminated the deserted road ahead. She knew the next encounter would be the final step before uncovering what really happened to Matt and the role she had played in all of it. The night was thick, and the silence around Clara as she drove to the mysterious address seemed to weigh down on her shoulders. The car's headlights illuminated only the narrow, deserted dirt road ahead, taking her far from the city center. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was a piece in a larger game, being led exactly where someone wanted her to be. Deep down, she knew she might be walking straight into a trap, but she couldn't turn back now. There was too much at stake, and the answers were closer than ever. The address led her to an old, seemingly abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. There was an air of decay around the place, as if it had been forgotten by time. Clara parked her car at a distance and observed the area for a few minutes, trying to discern any movement or sign that she was being watched. The silence was deep, oppressive, and the only sound she could hear was her own quickened breathing. She grabbed Matt's notebook, the only thing that gave her a shred of security, and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Clara stepped out of the car cautiously, feeling the wet ground under her feet as she approached the entrance of the building. Each step echoed in the emptiness around her, amplifying the feeling that she was being led straight into the lion's den. The building looked like it was falling apart, but there was something about it that seemed intentionally chosen, as if it were the perfect stage for the final confrontation. As she approached the door, Clara noticed it was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. Her heart beat faster with every second. When she stepped inside, the dark, claustrophobic space immediately enveloped her. The air was thick with dust and abandonment, but there was a palpable energy, like something was about to happen. Clara moved forward slowly, her steps measured, as the darkness pressed in around her. Then, she heard the sound of a door quietly closing behind her. Clara instinctively turned, but saw nothing but shadows. She knew she wasn't alone. The killer was there, watching her every move, and time was running out. Taking a deep breath, she moved deeper into the building until her eyes adjusted to the faint light seeping through the broken windows. In the center of the room stood a single chair, with one dim light hanging above it. The scene felt staged, a carefully constructed setup for what was about to unfold. Clara approached cautiously, her body tensing with each step. The sound of footsteps echoed around her, and then a deep voice broke the silence. "You've made it this far, Clara. Exactly where I knew you would be." The voice seemed to come from all directions, filling the space, but Clara couldn't pinpoint its source. Her body tensed, and she felt cold sweat on her palms. She knew she was about to face the truth she had been searching for, but she feared what that truth might mean. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked, her voice echoing in the empty room. There was a moment of silence, and then the same voice responded, now almost calm. "Because you needed to understand. Everything that happened, everything you've lost, was meant to bring you here." The words hung in the air, cryptic and provoking, but Clara couldn't fully process them. Her instincts told her something was deeply wrong. Then, from the shadows, a figure finally emerged. The man Clara had seen at the bar a few days earlier now stood before her, his eyes cold and calculating. He appeared calm, as though he had complete control of the situation. Clara took a step back instinctively, but her body felt frozen in place. "You remember Matt, don't you?" the man said, his voice carrying a quiet threat. Clara swallowed hard. Of course, she remembered. She had never been able to forget. Matt was getting too close to the truth. "And you've been involved without even knowing it," he continued, taking a step toward her. "We needed you. And now, you're exactly where we want you to be." His words echoed in Clara's mind like a blow. Everything Matt had written in his notes, everything she had been investigating, was starting to make sense. But how was she involved? And who were they? Clara took a step back, trying to process what the man was saying. "You killed him," she murmured, anger beginning to build inside her. The man gave a slight smile but didn't confirm or deny it. "Matt was an obstacle, just like you're becoming. But he tried to protect you, and now it's your turn to decide whether to give in to the truth or keep fighting it." Clara didn't know what he meant by that, but the pain of losing Matt, mixed with the terror of facing his killer, made her feel like she was on the verge of collapse. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice firmer than she felt. The man paused, watching her for a moment before answering. "You still don't understand, Clara? You've been part of this from the beginning. You've been manipulated, just like Matt. But now, it's your turn to make a choice. If you keep digging, you'll find out what really happened. But I promise you, you won't like what you find." Clara felt the weight of his words crashing down on her like a wave. The implications were terrifying. Could she really be involved in something without knowing? Or were they just trying to manipulate her even more? Before she could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows once again, leaving Clara alone in that dark, eerie space, with more questions than answers. She stood there for a long moment, his words reverberating in her mind. Now, she was at the center of everything. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the dark room, the sound of the man's footsteps fading into the distance. The air was heavy, and his words echoed in her mind with crushing force. "You've been part of this all along. It was impossible." She couldn't believe what she had just heard, but at the same time, she knew it was all starting to make a twisted, cruel kind of sense. Matt had tried to protect her. He knew more than anyone, and in the end, he had died for it. The realization that she had been manipulated all this time was a reality too hard to accept. Clara felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear she had never imagined facing. She knew there was no turning back now. Her whole life, every choice she had made, was somehow tied to this invisible web, spun by people in the shadows, controlling her like a puppet. Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the building's exit. The cold night air hit her like a punch, but Clara barely felt it. Her mind was racing, processing every detail, every clue she had received so far. There was no doubt that she had been used by forces she still didn't fully understand. And the most terrifying part was that Matt had known it all along. Clara got into her car, her trembling fingers gripping the steering wheel. The image of Matt flashed in her mind, clear and painful. He had known that his death was imminent, but he kept investigating. He had tried to protect her until the last second, never revealing just how deeply she was involved. Now, everything was up to her. Clara needed to make a choice, but what? To keep digging meant confronting a truth that could destroy her. To walk away meant living in the dark, never knowing what had really happened. Matt's notebook was still in her jacket pocket. Clara pulled it out and opened it again, her hands still shaking. There had to be something she had missed, something that could finally clarify the situation. She flipped through the pages quickly until a nearly faded note caught her eye. It was a simple sentence, almost as if Matt was speaking directly to her. The truth is a choice. Only you can decide if you want to see it. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline. Matt had known. He had always known. What was at stake wasn't just the corruption and the crimes they had been investigating. It was something much bigger. Something that had involved Clara from the very start. She just hadn't realized how deep it went. Now, she was about to find out. Determined, Clara started the car and sped down the empty streets. The address from the email stayed burned into her mind. She knew the next step would take her straight into the heart of what Matt had discovered. The man in the building had said she wouldn't like what she would find, but Clara couldn't live in ignorance anymore. Even if the truth was devastating, she had to know. The drive felt endless. The road stretched ahead like a dark, unknown tunnel, and with each mile she covered, Clara felt the weight of what was coming grow heavier. Finally, she arrived at an old industrial warehouse, isolated and covered in years of decay. Clara parked and got out of the car, taking a deep breath to gather her courage. She was ready to face whatever was waiting for her. There was no more time to hesitate. She entered the warehouse, the smell of rust and rotting wood filled the air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Clara moved forward until she found a door slightly ajar, with a faint light flickering inside. When she stepped in, what she saw made her stomach turn. Before her, pinned on a wall, photos were spread out like a chaotic map. Photos of Clara, of Matt, of the most recent victims, all connected by red strings. The killer had been watching their every move, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the center of it all, a large picture of Clara, with the word puppet scrawled across it in bold letters. Clara felt terror rising in her throat. She had been manipulated from the beginning, but not just by the killer. There was more. Much more. She slowly approached, her eyes scanning every detail. There were documents, emails, reports. Every investigation she had worked on was there, all controlled, monitored. That's when something in the notes caught her eye. A name, highlighted several times, Richard Townsend. The businessman Clara had investigated years ago, the one Matt believed was at the center of the conspiracy. Suddenly, everything became clear. Townsend wasn't just a name in a corruption investigation. He was at the heart of it all, pulling the strings, controlling everyone, including Clara. The warehouse doors swung open with a loud bang. Clara spun around quickly, and there, standing in the entrance, was the man who had confronted her earlier. He smiled coldly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Now you see, Clara. Townsend is behind it all. But the question is, what are you going to do with this truth? Clara looked around, her mind working frantically. She knew that from this moment on, there was no going back. If she confronted Townsend, her life would never be the same. But if she did nothing, she would seal her fate as just another puppet. I'm going to expose everything, she said firmly, her words echoing through the room. The man watched her for a moment before stepping back, leaving her alone with the truth. Clara knew she was stepping into uncharted territory, where the truth was dangerous and the enemy invisible. With one last look at the wall of photos, Clara turned and walked out. She was ready to face whatever came next. No matter how dangerous it was, the choice had been made.